My daughter hired a Feng Shui consultant who walked into my living room, pointed at my recliner, the one I have owned for 31 years, and told me it was blocking her financial energy. I just smiled and asked her one question. Her face went white as printer paper, and my son-in-law knocked a glass of water off the coffee table trying to stand up fast enough to stop me from finishing the sentence. He was too late. And by the end of this story, you are going to hear that question word for word, exactly the way I asked it, and you are going to understand why one quiet sentence from a 65-year-old retired postal supervisor undid 8 months of careful scheming in about 4 seconds. But first you need to know what was hiding inside that ugly mustard-colored chair. Because I promise you, it was not energy. Before we begin, thank you for being here with me tonight. If this story makes you laugh, or makes you angry, or both at the same time the way it made me feel that afternoon, I would love to know where you are watching from. Drop your city in the comments. And if stories like mine matter to you, please consider subscribing so you do not miss what comes next. After 3 years of watching strangers walk through my house pointing at my furniture, my own daughter stood in the kitchen doorway and said nothing while a woman with a brass compass told me my chair had to go. Neither of them knew what was hiding inside it, but one man did, and he was standing on my front porch, about to make a decision that would save me. My name is Walter Prout. Everyone has always called me Walt. I am 65 years old, and for 32 years I worked as a supervisor at the Regional Postal Distribution Center outside Asheville, North Carolina. The kind of job where you learn to read a room fast, because a warehouse full of tired people moving heavy boxes on a schedule does not run smoothly unless you can tell, at a glance, who is about to have a bad day before they even know it themselves. You learn something else in a job like that too, something that turned out to matter a great deal in this story. You learn that the people causing the biggest problems are almost never the ones raising their voices. They are the quiet ones, the friendly ones, the ones standing just off to the side of every decision, smiling, waiting for you to stop paying attention. I retired 6 years ago. My wife Alina and I had planned to spend our retirement traveling, cheap motels and state parks, the kind of trip where you argue about directions and laugh about it 20 minutes later. We got 2 good years of that before the diagnosis. Ovarian cancer, same as it so often is with the women in these stories, though every single one of them is somebody's whole world, not just a statistic in somebody else's video. Alina passed 5 years ago, and the house on Cedar Hollow Road, the house we had lived in since 1988, got very quiet very fast. I want to tell you about the recliner, because it matters more than any piece of furniture reasonably should, and because everything that happened to my family happened because of it. Alina and I bought it at an estate sale outside Hendersonville in 1993. A big ugly thing upholstered in a mustard-colored corduroy that even then looked 20 years out of fashion. But it had the deepest, most forgiving cushions either of us had ever sat in. And Alina, who had strong opinions about almost every piece of furniture we ever owned, took one look at it and said, "That chair is staying in this family until one of us dies in it." We paid the estate sale woman $18 for it. I remember the exact amount because Alina haggled her down from 25, and then felt so guilty about it on the drive home that she made me turn around so she could give the woman a jar of her strawberry preserves. That was Alina in one story. She would fight you over $7 and then give you something worth more than the $7 because winning felt worse than she expected. I have sat in that chair almost every evening for 31 years. I was sitting in it the night Alina told me about the diagnosis, her hand resting on my shoulder, both of us staring at a television neither of us was watching. I was sitting in it the night she died, 3 doors down the hall because I could not make myself sit anywhere else that night, and something about its shape, worn into the exact form of my own body after 3 decades, felt like the only solid thing left in a house that had suddenly gone strange and unfamiliar. I mention all this not to make you sad, but because I need you to understand something before the rest of this story makes sense. When somebody eventually told me that chair had to go, they were not asking me to get rid of furniture. They were asking me to get rid of the last place in the world where my wife's hand had rested on my shoulder. Keep that in mind, because the person who asked knew exactly what that chair meant to me, and asked anyway. My daughter Denise is 38 years old. She is my only child, and I loved her fiercely long before any of this happened. And I want to say clearly, before I tell you the rest of this story, that I still do. Whatever you feel about her over the next several minutes, and you are going to feel some things, I ask you to hold your judgment until the very end. People are more complicated than the worst 2 months of their lives. Denise married a man named Todd Cole 9 years ago, a charming, restless man who had opened, closed, and reopened 3 different restaurant concepts across 2 counties. By the time I finally understood that restlessness was not the same thing as ambition. Todd was, from the very first Thanksgiving I met him, a man who filled every silence in a room with a story about himself, who complimented my house a little too specifically, who asked, within the first hour of meeting me, what the property taxes ran on a place like this. I remember him standing in my dining room, holding a glass of sweet tea, looking at my ceiling beams the way other men look at a horse they are thinking about buying. Eleanor caught it before I did. She used to say Todd had the eyes of a man doing math while he talked to you. I laughed the first time she said it. I did not laugh the last time she said it, about a month before she passed, when she took my hand in that hospital room and told me, Walt, when I'm gone, you watch that man. I promised her I would. And then for 3 years I am ashamed to tell you I mostly forgot that promise. 3 years ago, Todd's third restaurant, an ambitious farm-to-table concept that had eaten most of their savings and a significant amount of borrowed money besides, collapsed within 8 months of opening. Denise called me in tears, the way 100 daughters in 100 stories like this one have called their fathers before her, and I did exactly what fathers in these stories always do. I told them to come home, move in with me, just until you get back on your feet. If you are watching this, and you have ever said those words to an adult child and their spouse, just until you get back on your feet, I want you to write in the comments how long, until turned out to be. I have a feeling I already know some of your answers. I want to walk you through those 3 years honestly, year by year, because the change was slow enough that I did not fully recognize it while I was living inside it. That is the part of these stories nobody warns you about. It never happens all at once. It happens one reasonable-sounding sentence at a time. Year 1 was, genuinely, good. Todd helped me clear out the gutters that first autumn. Denise cooked dinner most nights, something she had not done regularly since she was a teenager, and for a little while the house felt less like a museum of grief and more like a home with people moving through it again. On Sunday evenings, the 3 of us would eat at the kitchen table, and sometimes Denise would tell stories about her mother, and I would sit there thinking that maybe this arrangement was the thing pulling me back into the world. Todd talked openly about a new business idea, a food truck concept this time, smaller overhead, he said, less risk. I lent him $8,000 toward it, which he paid back, eventually in full, a fact I want to be fair enough to mention, because it made everything that followed considerably harder for me to see clearly when it started. That is how it works, by the way. The small, honest transaction early on is what buys them the credibility for the big, dishonest one later. Remember that $8,000. It was not generosity when he paid it back. It was an investment. By year 2, the food truck had folded as well, quietly, without much discussion, and something in Todd's posture around the house had shifted. He began referring to rooms by function rather than by history, calling my study, the room where Alina used to do her quilting, the second office, as though it existed for a purpose neither of us had ever assigned to it. He rearranged the garage without asking. He started using the word investment when he talked about the house, as in, this place is really an underutilized investment, Walt. Have you ever thought about what a renovation could do for the resale value? I had not thought about the resale value. I had thought about the fact that I built the back porch railing with my own hands the summer Denise turned 12, and that if you look closely at the third post from the left, you can still see where she carved her initials with my pocket knife, while I pretended not to notice. I had thought about the fact that Alina's garden still came up every spring in the same stubborn pattern she had planted it in decades earlier, tulips first, then the irises, then the peonies she used to talk to when she thought nobody was listening. Todd, I slowly came to understand over the course of that second year, was not thinking about any of that at all. To Todd, my house was a number with a roof on it, and I was the only thing standing between him and the number. Year 3, the year all of this eventually came to a head, began with Todd quieter around me than he had ever been, spending long stretches on his laptop at the kitchen table, with the screen angled away from the doorway, taking phone calls out on the back porch with the door pulled shut behind him. Twice that winter I walked into the kitchen, and he closed the laptop a little too quickly, and both times he covered it with the same easy smile and some comment about the weather. Denise noticed it too, I think, though neither of us said much about it directly to each other at the time, both of us perhaps hoping it was simply the ordinary stress of two failed businesses catching up with a man who had never quite learned how to sit still with disappointment. About 8 months ago, Todd came home from what he described as a business networking event with a business card and an idea. The card belonged to a woman named Vivian Marsh, who described herself, in cream-colored cursive lettering, as a certified Feng Shui and energy alignment consultant. Todd told me over dinner that night that Vivian had transformed the energy of his old restaurant partner's home office, and that given everything our family had been through financially, it might be worth having her take a look at the house, just to see if there were any blockages we could address. I laughed genuinely, the first real laugh I think I had managed in that kitchen in months. Todd did not laugh with me. Denise, I noticed, did not laugh either. She just looked down at her plate in the specific, careful way I would come to recognize, over the following months, as the exact posture of a person who has already decided not to argue. If you have ever watched someone you love practice that posture at your own kitchen table, you know it hurts worse than shouting ever could. Vivian Marsh came to the house 2 weeks later on a Saturday morning. She was maybe 50, dressed in flowing layers of neutral linen, carrying a small brass compass and a leather notebook, and she moved through my house the way a home inspector moves through a house they are secretly hoping to condemn, pausing meaningfully in doorways, murmuring things to herself, occasionally closing her eyes. I want you to remember that brass compass. It is going to come back at the end of this story, in a way I promise you will not see coming. She started in the kitchen, running her hand along the edge of the counter, and declaring the room's water element dangerously imbalanced, something she attributed to the placement of the sink relative to the stove. A configuration, she informed Todd and Denise, that had likely been quietly draining the household's financial luck for years without anyone realizing it. I stood there thinking that the only thing draining this household's financial luck was standing next to my daughter nodding along, but I kept that observation to myself, which, looking back, may have been my first mistake. She moved to the hallway next, pausing at the framed photographs of Alina that still lined the wall, tilting her head at them the way you might look at a painting hung slightly crooked, and suggested, gently, that displaying so many images of a deceased loved one in a high-traffic area could keep grief energy circulating through a home in ways that actively repelled new prosperity from entering it. I said nothing at that point, though something in my chest had already gone tight and cold in a way I did not yet have the words for. My wife's face, on my wall in my house, described as a circulation problem. I have replayed that moment many times since, and every single time I wish I had ended the visit right there. But I did not. Because my daughter was standing 4 feet away and I could see in her face that she wanted this to work, whatever this was, and a father will swallow almost anything to keep from breaking something his child is holding. She spent almost 40 minutes in the living room alone. 40 minutes. Remember that number 2 because at the time I thought it was theater. It was not theater. She was doing something in there, and it took me months to find out what. When she finally spoke, she told Todd and Denise, standing directly behind me while I sat in my own chair in my own living room, that the room's energy was severely stagnant, that the heavy, dark furniture was trapping wealth and opportunity from flowing naturally through the household, and that the single largest obstruction in the entire house was, without question, my recliner positioned, she said, in exactly the wrong relationship to the front door, actively repelling prosperity every single time someone walked in. She pulled out her brass compass at that point, held it above the chair for a long, theatrical moment, and announced that the reading confirmed what she had already sensed, that the piece was, in her words, spiritually and energetically obsolete, and that continuing to keep it in a place of prominence within the household would likely continue undermining the family's financial recovery for as long as it remained. Spiritually and energetically obsolete. A chair my wife picked out. A chair I was sitting in while a stranger stood behind me and pronounced it obsolete to my own family, the way you might pronounce a verdict over a man's casket while he is still breathing in it. I asked her, as politely as I could manage, whether she was suggesting my chair was personally responsible for my son-in-law's failed restaurants. She did not appreciate the question. Todd did not either. Denise, standing near the kitchen doorway, said nothing at all. That was the moment, though I did not fully understand it yet, that the real war over my house quietly began. I want to pause here because I think you deserve to guess where this is going before I tell you. A grown son-in-law with 2 failed businesses, an old man's paid-off house, a Feng Shui consultant who thinks a mustard-colored recliner is somehow responsible for her client's bank account, and 40 unexplained minutes alone in my living room. What do you think Todd Cole was actually planning underneath all that talk about financial energy? And what do you think Vivian Marsh was doing in that room for 40 minutes? Write your guesses in the comments below. I will tell you exactly how close you came, and I suspect some of you are going to get one of the 2 answers right, but almost none of you are going to get both. Over the following weeks, Vivian's assessment became the framework for an entire campaign, one that I initially, foolishly, interpreted as merely eccentric rather than deliberate. Todd began suggesting, gently at first, that we might want to consider donating the recliner, replacing it with something Vivian had recommended, a pale linen piece from a catalog that cost, I later discovered, nearly $2,000, an amount Todd and Denise's own financial situation made almost comically unaffordable. He even had the donation figured out already, a charity pickup service he said Vivian worked with regularly, very convenient. He said, they come right to the door, you never have to lift a finger. I want you to remember that pickup service too. This story has a lot of small details that come back around, and that one comes back around hard. I said no. Politely but clearly no. The chair stays. Todd's response to that no taught me more about him than 3 years of shared. His warmth, which had never been entirely convincing to begin with, cooled noticeably. He started making comments in front of Denise, about how difficult it must be at my age to adapt to new ideas, how some people simply got too attached to objects instead of people, how Vivian had mentioned in her professional opinion that resistance to letting go of old possessions was sometimes a sign of deeper cognitive rigidity worth monitoring. I want you to notice that phrase, cognitive rigidity worth monitoring, because it is going to matter a great deal later in this story. When somebody starts describing your ordinary preferences in medical-sounding language, they are not worried about you. They are building a file on you. I did not know that yet. I know it now, and by the end of this video, you will too. 2 months after Vivian's initial visit, Todd brought home a second guest, a man he introduced as an old friend from the restaurant industry named Gordon Finch, who he said had agreed as a favor to help assess which pieces of furniture in the house might be worth selling to fund what Todd was now openly calling our renovation project. Our renovation project of my house that he did not own a single board of. Gordon Finch turned out to be an antiques and estate appraiser, a fact Todd had conveniently left out of his introduction. Gordon walked through the house with considerably more genuine expertise than Vivian had displayed, examining joinery, running his fingers along the underside of drawers, checking makers' marks on the bottom of lamps. He was maybe 60, weathered hands, reading glasses pushed up into thinning gray hair, the kind of quiet, deliberate attention to detail that reminded me, oddly, of my own 32 years spent reading warehouse floors for small problems before they became large ones. When he got to my recliner, something in his posture changed entirely. He knelt down beside it, examined the wooden legs where they emerged from beneath the upholstery, went very still for a moment, and asked, very carefully, whether I knew who had originally made the chair. I told him honestly that I did not. Recliner and I had bought it for $18 at an estate sale 31 years earlier because it was comfortable, not because anyone had ever mentioned a maker. I told him the story, actually, standing right there in the living room, about Recliner declaring the chair would stay in the family until one of us died in it, about the strawberry preserves and the $7, and Gordon listened to the whole thing with an expression I could not quite read, somewhere between professional interest and something gentler underneath it. Gordon asked if he could take a few photographs. I said yes, mostly out of curiosity rather than any sense that something important was happening. He photographed the legs, the frame joints visible where the corduroy had worn thin near the base, and a small stamped mark on the underside I had genuinely never noticed in 3 decades of sitting in that chair. A tiny oval impression in the wood that looked, under his flashlight, almost like a signature. He asked me several more questions. When exactly the estate sale had been, whether I remembered anything about the house it came from, whether there had been other similar pieces at the same sale that I recalled. I answered what I could, though most of it had faded into the general blur of 31 years, and Gordon wrote everything down carefully in a small notebook of his own, not unlike the one I would soon start carrying myself. Gordon left that afternoon without saying much more, but I noticed, watching him go, that he and Todd had a brief, quiet conversation on the front porch that ended with Todd's expression shifting into something I had not seen from him before. A kind of sharp, focused attention that had nothing to do with Feng Shui or financial energy at all. I stood at the living room window and watched them for a moment, Todd's hands moving quickly as he talked, Gordon's face carefully neutral in the way I now recognize as the specific neutrality of a professional who has just realized he is standing in the middle of something he did not sign up for. 3 days later, Gordon called me directly, not Todd, which I would later understand mattered enormously to everything that followed. If Gordon Finch had been a slightly different kind of man, You would not be hearing this story. Or rather, you would be hearing a version of it where I am the confused old fool who gave away a fortune, told at some auction house as an amusing anecdote. The entire difference between those two stories came down to one man's decision about which phone number to dial. "Mr. Prout," he said, "I need to tell you something, and I need to tell you before anyone else has the chance to explain it to you first." He told me that the chair was, in his professional assessment, an extremely rare early production piece from a mid-century designer, whose original manufacturing run had been almost entirely destroyed in a factory fire in 1961, making surviving examples, particularly ones in original, unrestored upholstery like mine, worth a genuinely startling amount of money to serious collectors. He estimated conservatively a value between $60,000 and $90,000 at auction, possibly more depending on how competitive the bidding got among the handful of collectors who specialized in this particular maker's work. I sat down, not in the chair itself, but in the kitchen chair nearest the phone, and asked him to repeat the number, because I genuinely thought I had misheard him. $18. Recliner haggling over 7 of them. And now, a man with 40 years of appraisal experience telling me the ugly thing in my living room was worth more than I had earned in some entire years of my working life. Gordon repeated it. Then he told me the part that made my stomach turn cold. "Mr. Prout, your son-in-law asked me, on the porch before I left, not to mention this valuation to you directly. He asked me to route any offer or sale arrangement through him instead, as, in his words, the person managing the estate's assets going forward." The estate's assets. I was standing in my own kitchen, breathing my own air, paying my own bills, and my son-in-law was already describing my home as an estate. There is only one situation in which a living man's house becomes an estate, and I did not care for what that implied about Todd's plans for me. I asked Gordon, my voice steadier than I felt, whether he had agreed to that. "I told him I don't work that way," Gordon said. "The chair belongs to you. I answer to the owner, not to whoever happens to be standing on the porch when I leave." I thanked him, more sincerely than I think he understood, and hung up the phone and sat in that kitchen for a long time putting together, piece by piece, exactly what had been happening in my own house for the previous 2 months. Vivian Marsh's insistence that the chair had to go, the convenient charity pickup service, Todd's escalating campaign to have it donated or replaced, the comments about cognitive rigidity, the 40 minutes Vivian spent alone in my living room. None of it, I now understood with total clarity, had ever been about energy flow or financial prosperity in any spiritual sense at all. It had been about getting a $90,000 chair out of my house, and, I strongly suspected, into Todd's hands cheaply, quietly, before I ever learned what it was actually worth. Here is the question I could not answer yet, though, and I want you to sit with it the way I had to. How did Todd know? Gordon's appraisal visit came after months of Vivian's campaign against the chair. So either Todd got astonishingly lucky, pushing to remove the one piece of furniture in the house that happened to be worth a fortune, or somebody had known what that chair was long before Gordon Finch ever knelt down beside it. Hold that question. It has an answer, and the answer is worse than you think. I did not confront Todd that evening. I wanted to understand the full shape of what I was dealing with first, the way I used to walk an entire warehouse floor before deciding how to fix a bottleneck rather than reacting to the first problem I happened to see. 32 years of management teaches you that the man who acts on the first piece of information he gets is usually the man who ends up apologizing later. The following week, I drove into town and hired an attorney named Patricia Alvarez, a sharp, unhurried woman recommended to me by my neighbor Ray Delgado, a retired mechanic who had lived 3 houses down from me for over 20 years, and who had, over the previous 8 months, watched the changing traffic of consultants and appraisers through my driveway with the same quiet, patient suspicion I probably should have applied myself much sooner. Ray, I should tell you now, is going to do something later in this story that still makes me smile every time I think about it. Stay with me for that if nothing else. Patricia's office was small, tucked above a bakery downtown, and she listened to the entire account without interrupting once, taking notes in a neat, economical hand, occasionally asking a clarifying question. When she finished reviewing everything, Vivian's assessment, Gordon's valuation, Todd's request that any sale route through him, she told me plainly that while none of what had happened so far was clearly illegal, the pattern, taken together, looked very much like the early stages of financial exploitation of an elderly homeowner, a category of case, she explained, that had become considerably more common in her practice over the previous decade. Though it rarely arrived wearing a costume as strange as a Feng Shui consultant, I need you to keep a log, Patricia told me. Every conversation about the chair, about the house, about your finances. Dates, exact words, who was present. If this escalates, and situations like this usually do, that documentation is going to matter enormously. She also recommended that same afternoon that I have Gordon's appraisal formally notarized and copied, one set for a lockbox, one set kept off-site entirely at Ray's house if I trusted him, which I told her I did without hesitation. I bought a spiral notebook the next morning, the same brand I had used for 32 years of shift reports at the postal center, and I started writing. If you take one practical thing away from this entire story, it cost $2.49, and it ended up being worth more than the chair. 2 weeks later, the escalation Patricia had warned me about arrived, and it arrived in a form I genuinely had not anticipated. Todd sat me down at the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening, Denise standing nearby with her arms crossed in a way that told me she already knew what was coming, and told me, with a gentleness that had clearly been rehearsed, that he and Denise had been talking to a lawyer of their own about what he called a proactive family planning conversation, given, he said, some changes they had noticed in my behavior lately. My resistance to reasonable suggestions. My increasing attachment to old objects over practical decisions. My apparent difficulty, he said, choosing his words with obvious care, adapting to necessary changes in the household. He had brought a folder to the table. I noticed, thin but official looking, and he tapped it twice with 2 fingers before continuing, as though its mere presence lent weight to everything he was saying. He mentioned, almost casually, that Vivian had actually recommended a colleague of hers, a geriatric care consultant, who specialized in helping families navigate exactly these kinds of transitions, someone who could conduct what he called a gentle, non-invasive assessment, purely for everyone's peace of mind. Notice how the same woman who diagnosed my chair now had a colleague ready to diagnose me. Funny how that network operates. Every problem they invent comes with a professional. They already know who can bill you for solving it. I asked him directly whether he was suggesting I was not competent to manage my own affairs. Todd did not answer that question directly. He said only that they wanted to explore together as a family whether some additional support structures might make sense going forward. Support structures that, as he described them further, sounded very much like a guardianship arrangement with himself listed as the party providing that support. He used the phrase asset protection twice during that conversation, a phrase that had nothing to do, as far as I could tell, with protecting anyone's assets except his own eventual. I looked at Denise. She would not meet my eyes. She stood very still by the counter, arms still crossed, staring down at the floor with the specific fixed attention of someone trying very hard not to have an opinion about something she clearly already had a strong opinion about. I did not raise my voice. 32 years of managing a warehouse floor teaches you that raising your voice rarely gets you anything except a room full of people who have stopped actually listening. I told Todd calmly that I would think about what he had said, and I went to my study that evening and wrote down every word of that conversation while it was still fresh. The way Patricia had told me to, including the folder, including the phrase asset protection, including the fact that Denise had not said a single word the entire time. Todd tried a different approach 4 days later, one that surprised me considerably more than the guardianship conversation had. He knocked on my study door that evening, something he rarely bothered doing, and asked if we could talk, just the two of us, man to man. He had brought 2 glasses of the good bourbon I kept for occasions I could no longer remember the last of, and he sat across from me in the chair I normally reserved for guests, looking, for the first time in months, almost sheepish. "Walt," he said, "I think we got off on the wrong foot with all this. The Vivian thing, the conversation about support structures, I know how that must have sounded. I want you to know none of that was ever about pushing you out. I just worry, genuinely worry about you being alone in this big house as you get older, and I handled expressing that worry badly. I let him talk. I have found, over a long career of managing difficult conversations on a warehouse floor, that people who are lying to you often say considerably more than people who are telling the truth, if you simply give them enough silence to fill. Todd filled 20 minutes of it. He proposed that evening what he called a fresh start, an arrangement where he would personally manage the chair's eventual sale, taking what he described as a modest 10% finder's fee for handling the transaction professionally, given his business background, while ensuring, he said, that I received fair market value without having to deal with the stress and complexity of dealing with collectors and auction houses myself. He made the number sound generous. 10% of $90,000, delivered in that warm, reasonable tone, is $9,000, a fact I noticed he never actually said out loud. But here is what I actually heard in that study, and I want you to hear it too, because it is the moment the whole scheme cracked open in front of me. Todd said fair market value. Todd said collectors and auction houses. I had never told Todd what Gordon found. Gordon had refused to tell him. And yet here was my son-in-law, sitting in my study, casually negotiating his percentage of a valuation he was not supposed to know existed, which meant somebody else had told him what that chair was worth. And there was only one other person who had ever shown an unusual interest in that chair. A person with a brass compass and 40 unexplained minutes in my living room. I told him I would think about that too. I did not think about it for very long. That same offer, 10%, no written contract, no independent appraisal disclosure, went directly into my spiral notebook that night, dated and detailed, along with a note in the margin, underlined twice. He already knows the number. Find out how. The answer to that question knocked on my door 11 days later. But before it did, Todd made his biggest mistake of the entire affair, and he made it while I was at a dentist appointment. I had a routine cleaning scheduled for a Thursday morning, an appointment that had been on the kitchen calendar for a month, in plain view of everyone in the house. I mention that detail so you understand what happened next was not a coincidence. When I pulled out of the driveway at 9:15, Ray Delgado happened to be out front watering his azaleas, and Ray, being Ray, gave me a wave and kept one eye on my house, because that is simply what he had been doing for weeks by then without ever being asked. At 9:40, a box truck pulled into my driveway. Charity donation pickup, 2 men, a clipboard, and a work order for the removal of 1 reclining chair, signed by Todd Cole, listed on the paperwork. Ray told me later He walked across those 3 lawns slower than he had ever walked anywhere in his life, because he wanted to make sure his temper arrived after he did. He planted himself on my front porch steps, all 5'7" of him, 68 years old, holding a garden hose he had not bothered to put down, and informed those 2 men that the gentleman who owned that chair was at the dentist, that the man who signed that work order did not own so much as a doorknob on this property, and that if they wanted to test the question, he would be happy to stand right there while they called the sheriff's department to sort out. The pickup men, to their credit, looked at the paperwork, looked at Ray, looked at Todd standing in the doorway with his arms crossed, and decided this was not what they were paid for. They left without the chair. Ray stayed on my steps, watering my flower bed with his own hose, until I got home an hour later with clean teeth and no idea how close I had just come to losing everything. When Ray told me what had happened, I did not get angry. I got quiet. There is a difference, and every warehouse man knows it. Anger is loud and burns off fast. Quiet is what you feel when a decision gets made somewhere deep in your chest, all at once, without any noise. That afternoon, I wrote 4 pages in the notebook called Patricia and ordered a set of small security cameras, which Ray helped me install that same weekend. One covering the driveway, one covering the front porch, and one, though I told no one at all about this one, inside the living room itself, tucked between 2 of Aliner's books on the top shelf, aimed directly at the chair. I want to be honest with you about how it felt to do that. It felt terrible. A man should not have to point a camera at his own living room to protect himself from his own family. If you are watching this and you have ever had to do something similar, put a word in the comments, even just the word same. I read every comment on these videos, and I have learned there are a lot more of us than anyone talks about. 3 days after the cameras went in, someone knocked on my door with a clipboard, and this time it was not a donation crew. A woman named Carol Jennings stood on my porch, holding a county identification badge, introducing herself as an investigator with Adult Protective Services, explaining that her office had received a report expressing concern about my welfare and cognitive state. Let me say that again, so it lands the way it landed on me. Somebody had reported me, Walter Prout, to the county as a potentially incompetent elderly man. And I think you and I both know, without my having to say it, whose signature style was all over that report. I let her in. She was maybe 45, tired-eyed in the specific way of someone who has spent a career walking into other people's worst days, and she moved through the standard questions with the same patient thoroughness I imagine she brought to every visit, regardless of how obviously unfounded a given complaint turned out to be. What's today's date? Who is the current governor of North Carolina? Can you tell me what medications you take and how often? I answered every question clearly and precisely, the way I used to answer questions from regional management during a shift audit, back when a wrong answer could mean a whole warehouse floor losing its afternoon schedule. She walked through my house, checked my kitchen, my medicine cabinet, my finances, my calendar, and found a man whose home was clean, whose bills were paid on time, whose mind was entirely intact. She spent a long moment in my study, looking at the lockbox Ray had helped me install, and asked what I kept in it. I told her honestly, legal documents related to an ongoing family dispute over a piece of furniture. She raised an eyebrow slightly but did not press. In the living room, she paused in front of the recliner itself, the very object at the center of the report she was investigating, and looked at it for a long moment before turning back to me. "This is the chair," she said. It was not really a question. "This is the chair," I confirmed. She made a note, and something about her expression, careful and unreadable through most of the visit, softened just slightly. Before she left, Carol told me something that Patricia later described as unusually candid for someone in her position. She said the report had specifically emphasized what it called my growing obsession with an old chair as evidence of concerning behavior, and that in 12 years of doing this work, she had developed a fairly reliable instinct for the difference between a family member genuinely worried about a parent's welfare and a family member building a paper trail toward something else entirely. "Mr. Prout," she said, standing at my front door, "this case is going to be closed as unsubstantiated. But I would encourage you to keep talking to your attorney. And," she added, almost as an afterthought, "if that chair really is worth what I suspect you're about to tell me it's worth, you might want to consider a home security system in the meantime." I told her the cameras had been running for 3 days. She smiled for the first time in the entire visit and said, "Good. You would be surprised how rarely I get to say this, Mr. Prout, but I do not think you need protecting at all. I think somebody in this house badly underestimated you." 8 nights later, one of those cameras earned back every penny I paid for it. It was a Sunday, close to midnight. I was in bed. The living room camera, the one nobody knew about, caught the lamp clicking on at 11:52. Todd came in first in his socks, moving the way a man moves when he has rehearsed being quiet. And behind him, in her flowing linen, carrying that brass compass and a phone held up in front of her like a lantern, came Vivian Marsh. In my house, at midnight, uninvited by anyone whose name was on the deed. What the camera recorded over the next 19 minutes answered every question I had been carrying for months. Vivian tipped my chair carefully onto its side. She photographed the stamped mark on the underside, the little oval signature Gordon had found, except, and this is the part that made my hands go cold watching the footage, she went to it directly. No searching, no examining. She knew exactly where that mark was, which meant she had found it once before, during 40 unexplained minutes alone in my living room, 8 months earlier on her very first visit. Then she propped her phone against the coffee table, and for several minutes she and Todd stood over my tipped-over chair talking to a man on a video call, a man whose voice the camera microphone caught clearly enough, discussing condition, original upholstery, and what he called realistic net after his handling fee, out of a Charlotte storefront he mentioned by name. So there was the answer to the question I asked you to hold. Todd had not gotten lucky. Vivian Marsh had recognized that chair inside the first hour of her first visit. The entire Feng Shui campaign, the blocked prosperity, the grief energy, the spiritually obsolete furniture, every bit of it had been invented afterward as a costume, to walk a $90,000 chair out my front door disguised as a charitable donation, straight to a resale dealer in Charlotte who would split the proceeds with the helpful consultant who kept the pieces coming. And my son-in-law, somewhere along the way, had been cut in, or had cut himself in, and had then spent months trying to have me declared incompetent as insurance in case I ever said no loudly enough to matter. I watched that footage 3 times. Then I called Patricia, who watched it once and said a word I will not repeat on this channel, followed by a sentence I will. "Walt," she said, "do not confront anyone yet. Let them schedule their own funeral. Knowing them, they will even send you an invitation." She was right. The invitation arrived the following week, when Todd announced over dinner, warmly, as though offering me a gift, that Vivian had generously agreed to come do a follow-up assessment that Saturday to check on the household's progress. I understood immediately what it actually was. Documentation. One more professional visit, one more report about the stubborn old man and his obsession, one more page in the Guardian. I smiled and said that sounded fine, and asked only that Denise be home for it, since this concerned the whole family. Todd agreed so quickly it nearly made me laugh, and that Saturday afternoon is the moment this story started with. So let me finally pay you what I owe you. Vivian arrived at 2 o'clock, swept through her routine, and finished, as I knew she would, in the living room where she pointed at my recliner, the one I have owned for 31 years, and told the room with professional sadness that the obstruction remained, and that she could feel the household's financial energy still straining against it. Denise stood in the kitchen doorway. Todd stood by the window, arms folded, already composing his next report in his head. I just smiled, and from the side table drawer I took out a single printed photograph, a still frame from the camera footage, Vivian and Todd in my upside-down chair at midnight, and I laid it on the coffee table facing her, and I asked her one question. Before you tell me again what my chair is blocking, Miss Marsh, would you like to explain to my daughter what your dealer friend in Charlotte pays you for every piece of spiritually obsolete furniture your clients donate through that pickup service of yours? Or should we all just watch the video together? Her face went white as printer paper. Todd knocked a glass of water off the coffee table trying to get to me, to the photograph, to anything, and it did not matter, because Denise had already crossed the room and picked it up. I watched my daughter look at that image, the midnight timestamp, her husband's socked feet, her father's tipped-over chair, and I watched 8 months of careful doubt leave her face all at once, replaced by something I had not seen since she was 12 years old and caught a classmate cheating off her math test. Vivian Marsh gathered her compass and her notebook and walked out of my house without one more word about energy. She left so fast she took our prosperity with her. Todd started explaining. He was still explaining when Denise walked past him out the front door and sat in her car in the driveway for 1 hour and 40 minutes. Ray, watering his azaleas, told me later he had never wanted so badly to bring somebody a casserole and a baseball bat at the same time. Patricia scheduled a formal mediation for the following month. Our best chance, she said, to settle the chair's ownership before it became litigation. What happened in that conference room took 11 minutes. Todd arrived with an attorney named Bradley Wexler, who opened by arguing that the chair, having sat in a shared household for 3 years, was functionally shared property. Patricia let him finish. Then she placed on the table, one at a time, like a dealer laying out a losing man's cards for him, Gordon Finch's notarized appraisal, Gordon's signed statement describing Todd's porch request, which she read aloud, slow. My spiral notebook, open to the guardianship conversation, the asset protection phrasing, the 10% bourbon offer, the donation work order with Todd's signature under the word homeowner, and last, a laptop turned to face Wexler, cued to the midnight footage. She did not even press play. Wexler looked at the freeze frame, looked at his client, and asked for a recess in the voice of a man who had just learned what he had actually been hired to defend. Denise did not wait for the recess. She stood, looked at her husband, and said quietly, "You knew what it was worth the whole time. You had that woman tell my father his dead wife's photographs were a circulation problem. And then you reported him to the county. Get out." He got out. Denise stayed. What followed was not the immediate tearful reconciliation you might expect, and I think it matters that I tell you that honestly. Denise moved out that same week, staying first with Ray and Connie, then in a small rental across town, and we spoke only in careful, awkward fragments for nearly a month. Then, on a Tuesday, I found a letter in my mailbox, my name on the envelope in the same handwriting I remembered from 40 years of birthday cards. I sat down on the front steps to read it, because the weight of it told me not to walk any further first. "Dad," it began. "I am so ashamed of how long it took me to see what Todd was doing. I told myself Vivian was harmless nonsense. I told myself the guardianship talk was just caution. I did not want to see it clearly, because seeing it clearly meant admitting I married a man capable of working to have my own father declared incompetent over a piece of furniture. I keep thinking about the first night Vivian came, when I stood in the kitchen doorway and said nothing while she talked about your chair, and about every night after that when I did the same thing, until I could not tell anymore whether I was protecting my marriage or just protecting myself from admitting what it had become. You built that porch railing with your own hands. You never once made me feel like an inconvenience, even when I brought a man into your house who spent 3 years treating you like an obstacle. Mom used to say Todd had the eyes of a man doing math while he talked to you, and I got defensive every time she said it, and I would give anything now to go back and listen to her instead. I do not expect you to forgive me quickly. I am not sure I have forgiven myself. But I would like to come home, not to live, just to visit and start figuring out how to be your daughter again instead of his wife first. I see a divorce attorney Thursday. I wanted you to hear it from me. I love you, Dad. I am sorry it took a $90,000 chair for me to finally see clearly. I called her that same evening. She came over 3 days later and we sat in the living room in my chair and in her old spot on the couch, and we talked for almost 4 hours about the chair, the mediation, the years Alina spent worrying about Todd before either of us understood why. She cried twice. I did too, once when she apologized in person, and once near the end when she asked whether her mother would have been disappointed in her. And I told her, as honestly as I have ever told her anything, that Alina would have been proud of exactly this moment, the moment she finally chose to see something clearly and act on it, even later than either of us would have liked. The divorce finalized 5 months later. Todd, facing the mediation record, the footage, and a formal complaint Patricia filed with the state's Consumer Protection Division, signed away any claim to the chair, and paid my legal fees to make the rest go away. Vivian Marsh turned out to have a standing arrangement with that Charlotte dealer stretching back years, steering clients toward donating exactly the kind of overlooked, unglamorous pieces that occasionally turn out to be worth a great deal, in exchange for a quiet percentage after resale. The state board, once Gordon put that connection in writing, took a strong interest in her certification. The last I heard, her website was gone, and somewhere out there is a brass compass that never once pointed at the only thing in my house that was actually poisoning it. The chair sold at a specialty auction 4 months after that. I drove up and sat in the back row, and I will admit to you that when the bidding passed $60,000 and 2 phone bidders kept going, I laughed out loud once and could not entirely stop, and the woman next to me asked if I was all right, and I told her, "Ma'am, my wife paid $18 for that thing and made me drive back to deliver strawberry preserves out of guilt." Final price, $82,000, to a collector in Chicago. I split the proceeds evenly with Denise, not because any court required it, but because she spent 5 months proving she was still the daughter who used to do homework on that couch while I read the paper in that ugly, wonderful chair. The months since have been the quiet, ordinary kind that never make it into videos like this one, and I treasure every uneventful week of them. Denise kept her own apartment even after the divorce, telling me over coffee that she needed to know she could build a life entirely on her own before leaning on anyone again, myself included. I respected that more than I told her. She went back to work, first at a bookstore, then in the marketing field she trained for before Todd slowly talked her out of herself. Ray and Connie remained what they had quietly become, family. Connie taught Denise to can tomatoes that September, a skill Alina once tried and failed to pass down, and I stood in my kitchen listening to the two of them laugh over a pot of boiling water and thought, for the first time in years, that the house finally sounded like a home again instead of a battlefield with good lighting. Denise visits every other Sunday. We sit in the living room, in a newer, plain gray recliner I bought with a small piece of the proceeds, deliberately unremarkable, because I earned the right to sit in a chair nobody will ever again try to convince me is secretly worth fighting over. Last month, on what would have been Alina's 68th birthday, Denise brought over a photo album she had built in secret, Alina in the garden, Alina holding Denise on the porch I built the railing for, and somewhere in the middle of it, she reached over and squeezed my hand the exact way her mother used to when she thought I was overthinking something. The railing still holds. The garden still comes up every spring in Alina's stubborn pattern. And somewhere in Chicago, a collector sits, I assume most evenings, in a very comfortable, very ugly, mustard-colored chair that held an entire family together through its hardest years, long before anyone thought to ask what it was worth. If there is one thing I want you to take from this, it is that manipulation does not always arrive wearing an obvious face. Sometimes it arrives smelling like sage, speaking the gentle language of wellness and family planning. If someone close to you starts describing your ordinary preferences, the chair you like, the routine you keep, as evidence of a deeper problem worth monitoring, that language deserves scrutiny long before the person using it deserves your trust. Write things down. Keep receipts, appraisals, dates. A $2 notebook beat a lawyer, a consultant, and 8 months of scheming, because the people who count on you never questioning them are the same people who benefit most from you having nothing in writing when you finally do. And here is the second, stranger lesson. Sometimes the thing everyone around you is working hardest to convince you to give away quietly is exactly the thing worth one honest, outside look before you let it go. Not every ugly old chair is worth $90,000, but every stubborn attachment deserves at least one independent opinion before you surrender it. I got lucky that Gordon Finch was an honest man. Not everyone gets that luck. So build the habit of asking the question yourself before luck has to answer it for you. If this story made you laugh, or made you go check the underside of your own ugly old furniture, tell me in the comments what you found under there. And if you guessed back at the beginning what Vivian was really doing during those 40 minutes, tell me that too and be honest about it. If you want more stories like this one, please subscribe so you do not miss what I have to share next. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. Trust your instincts, keep your receipts, and never, ever let anyone with a brass compass tell you which chair your wife would have wanted you to keep. A final note before you go. Certain names, locations, and identifying details in this story have been altered to protect the privacy of everyone involved. If you or someone you know is navigating a family financial dispute involving an elderly relative, please consult a qualified attorney directly.